Thank you, Madam President, for the honour of speaking in tonight's debate. Before moving into my own arguments, which Chloe preempts pretty well, and I hope to be able to deal with, I also have the pleasure of introducing the speaker's on-side proposition. We've just heard from Chloe Davis, who reads philosophy and theology at Pembroke College and is Chief of Staff here at the Union. Despite mocking my competitive debating origins, I have actually heard that Chloe had a go at debating in year 10, where she attended a competitive debating academy for her summer hobby. But after listening to her speech, I think she chose the right side of the Union. I am, of course, joking. Chloe's speech was very insightful and a pleasure to listen to. She's clearly very hungry to win the debate tonight, although I hear not as hungry as she was when the Oxford Union Committee recently attended Cambridge. Recently, we went there, and Chloe took the astute decision to come and steal a fellow member of committee's food after eating her own because they were running a bit late. I'm just very sorry I couldn't warn our other illustrious speakers of this before they had the debate dinner. After Chloe, you'll hear from Phil Zuckerman, who's a highly renowned professional sociologist who has written a great number of many brilliant books focused on secularism, atheism, and non-religious worldviews. You'll then hear from Alex O'Connor, who is the founder of the Cosmic Skeptic YouTube channel and the Within Reason podcast, and someone whose work I greatly admire. I also know Alex was hosted earlier this year at the Cambridge Union. I'm just glad he's got the promotion to the place that's actually worth coming to. Finally, you'll hear from Dan Barker, who is the co-founder of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which does significant work that he was telling me about over dinner in ensuring the separation of church and state, and on which he is a great expert. Madam President, these are our guests for tonight, and they are very welcome. The first thing I want to do in my speech is clarify a bit more on the word of delusion that Chloe has done some of the work for me on already. Because I want to be very clear about what this motion requires each side to prove in the debate. This motion is not, this House believes that it's more likely than not that God doesn't exist. It is also not, this House believes that on the balance of probabilities God doesn't exist, and it is not, this House believes in no God. This motion makes a stronger claim. It claims that God is a delusion. Chloe defines this for us in saying that it's a false belief that we hold about reality despite irrefutable evidence to the contrary. Now, I think it'd be unfair to the speakers on proposition to force them to show irrefutably that God doesn't exist. But I do think if we think about the way we use the word delusion, it does confer a higher burden for their side of the house than it does for ours. We describe people who think the world is flat as deluded, or if you had a friend who said they were going to be the next prime minister, you might say they're suffering a delusion. But suppose you checked the weather and found out there was a 70% chance of rain this evening. Fortunately not. You might have a friend who then looks up at the sky and claims that no, they don't see any clouds, it's not going to rain. You would probably think that your friend was wrong in this instance. Indeed, presumably you'd think there was a 70% chance that they were wrong, but you wouldn't call your friend deluded on account of this claim. After all, they have a 30% chance of being right. And so I ask everyone who's going to be voting tonight, even if you have come to the chamber an atheist and you don't think God's existence is likely, you shouldn't necessarily be voting for side proposition tonight. By the end of this debate, if we can convince you there's a 20 or 30% chance that God exists, you should vote for us. Because maybe we're wrong like your friend, but we are certainly not so implausibly wrong as to be deluded. With that burden set up, I will now turn to my argument about the fine-tuning of our universe and the evidence that provides for the existence of a God. I want to start by asking when you should believe something about our reality. Because in our world, there's a huge number of phenomena and observations that we make that require theories or hypotheses to explain them. The way we decide which theories are true is by examining the phenomena around us and determining which of our hypotheses best explains or would predict the observations that we actually make. The hypothesis that does this best is the one that we should believe. This process is called inference to the best explanation, and it's what underlies our scientific method. We believe the Newton's laws of gravity that are brought up, not because they sound cool or because Newton said them, but because we observe objects falling to the ground around us, and his theory being true is what would best explain that evidence. It also underlies our criminal justice system. We may not see someone commit a robbery and have irrefutable evidence that they did, but if their fingerprints were there, their car was at the scene, and they have no alibi, we will convict them anyway, because the hypothesis that they committed the crime explains the evidence better than the hypothesis that they did not commit the crime. Therefore, I'm quite unclear at the end of Chloe's speech on why she thinks this sort of reasoning isn't appropriate. It's an inference from the evidence that we have and whether our theories would predict that to determine whether our theories are then accurate. Now, given that process for forming beliefs, let me tell you one of the most remarkable facts about our universe and one of the most remarkable sets of evidence and observations that we have ever made. Our universe has a number of crucial constants that do not vary across space or time. For example, the speed of light, Planck's constant, the strength of the weak and strong force, and so on. These constants are absolutely critical to reality. If you ask any physical question about the world and continue to ask why it's there or why it happened, you will persistently and eventually lead to the constants. They are where our physical explanations stop. Einstein famously said that what really interested him most was whether God could have created the world any differently, by which he meant, why are the constants the way that they are? Why is it they take these particular values? But what's most incredible about these constants is how finely tuned they are to allow for the creation of life. Despite it seeming perfectly logically possible that these constants could take a large range of values, they are configured in such a way that allows just and only just for life's existence. To take just one example, the cosmological constant, which drives the expansion rate of the universe, was so finely tuned that if it was randomly picked amongst the values it could have taken, the chances you would get a life-permitting value like we have currently would be 1 in 1 times 10 to the 120. So that's 1 followed by 120 zeros. If it was any bigger, the universe would expand too fast and rip matter to shreds, and if it was any weaker, the universe would have never expanded in the first place. This is an extraordinary observation, and like the rest of science in the world around us, this is something we should attempt to explain and understand. We then have two theories before the house that might help with this deep mystery of the universe. The first is that God doesn't exist, and the second that is he does. Let's begin with the first. If God doesn't exist, we must seek a physical or metaphysical explanation for the constants being so incredibly finely tuned for life. The first option here is to put it down to mere chance. Perhaps we just got lucky with these constants taking these random values. But the degree of luck we're talking about here makes this explanation unacceptable. To put the figure I gave you previously in context, if you marked one atom in the universe and then took an atom at random, you would have a much better chance of finding the atom you marked than you would on getting this life-permitting value of constants. This is clearly unacceptable, and so physicists and philosophers alike have sought alternative physical explanations for why the constants take the values that they do. I'll consider two of the most popular ones here. The first hypothesis you may think about is that the constants aren't necessarily taking the values that they do, and there is some way in which they are baked into reality that they must take their given values. The problem with this explanation is, like Chloe points out with much of the issue for God, there's no evidence that the constants couldn't have taken different values, and it's perfectly compatible with many of our theories, and there seems no inherent logical contradiction in the idea that G could have been 7 rather than 6.67. Some scientists have looked to theories of inflation and used this claim that the physical laws in some way will physically necessitate this. However, any explanation of this kind is simply likely to push the problem back a step, because we will then ask, why do the physical laws necessitate that we take this life-preserving and enabling value? And could those laws have varied? The second hypothesis we might have on what could physically explain the constants is, you might think, if you've read a bit of physics or science fiction, is multiverse theory. This is the idea that there's a vast number of universes, and we are only living in one of them. This would make it possible, because if there was a very large number of universes, then even if it's unlikely our constants took this value, we would still expect it to happen over the course of the universe. However, the problem with this is that most scientific theories which assume multiverse claim there are a large number of universes, but not nearly to the degree that would be necessary for us to expect to be in a universe with these constants. In string theory, for instance, it's postulated that 10 to the power of 500 vacuum states that could be different universes could exist. But that's far beyond what would be, or far below what would be necessary in order for us to expect to get a constant in the value needed for life to be explained and allowed. This then leaves the only rational way out of this for someone who's concerned about logic to postulate the existence of an infinite number of universes. Now, perhaps that's plausible, but it's not in any mainstream scientific theory, and it seems to have a lot of baggage that comes along with it. Let's now consider hypothesis 2, that God does exist, what I'm defending in this debate. If God designed the universe, then insofar as he's our creator, he could have presumably picked what these constants took the value of. This means he has the capacity to pick the constant's value. Moreover, whilst I admit that we do not have great access to what God would care about, it seems that many different forms of gods, not just Abrahamic ones, would have reason to create humans and life. Abrahamic gods would care about perhaps having good and thinking that they could have persons who could come into the world and do good actions freely, but so could other gods that were perhaps bad or neutral about morality if they were just interested in the way that life would come about and how it would work. Given that, it seems we have a number of plausible reasons to think that a god would have an incentive to create life, and he would have the ability to configure them in this way that is necessary for life to exist. Now, I think what I've shown you is that we have quite a deep problem in reality, in that we must choose between either a hypothesis that says that there must be an infinite number of universes in order to explain the fact that we are here now, or you must believe that there is a God, which to many people seems an outlandish idea. I think it seems more plausible that there's a God and someone that configured these figures rather than some infinite number of universes we have no contact with, can't know about, and no scientists defend to explain the constants. But even if you don't believe me, I hope that I've shown to you that at least there is a decent chance that God could be the best explanation that we're going to have for this. And if you want to go back to the thing I told you at the start about inference to the best explanation, it clearly seems to be one we should highly consider. If an explanation seems plausible when we compare it to the alternative best explanations, such an explanation must be plausible, it must stand, and this must not be considered a delusion. Proud to oppose.